Howdy, partners. Tonight we're swapping philosophy for something just as mind-blowing. The grub served in Wild West saloons. Sure, these joints were famous for whiskey brawls and off-key piano tunes. But what really filled cowboys' bellies? Was it just beans and bacon, or did those swinging doors hide some tasty surprises? Before you settle in, smash that like button if you're enjoying this ride, and subscribe if you're genuinely digging my content. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global posse gathering. Now dim those lights, maybe crank up a fan for that perfect background hum, and let's mosey into tonight's adventure. That first step through saloon doors didn't hit you with music or gambling shouts. It walloped you with smells. Forget romanticized steak sizzles and fresh cornbread aromas. The real bouquet was more like a punch to the nose, a funky cocktail of sweaty ranch hands, stale tobacco, spilled beer, damp timber, and horses that hadn't seen a bath since the Civil War. If you were lucky, you might catch a whiff of something cooking in back. Some joints tossed sawdust on floors or pumped out enough pipe smoke to erase your memory, while others just embraced the stench. Ain't here for the air, barkeeps would say, swatting flies with rags that hadn't been cleaned since gold was discovered in California. Yet somehow, every dive had a kitchen, maybe just a fire pit with a bean pot bubbling over coals, or a grumpy cook in a soot-stained apron stirring mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a weapon. If you could smell grub through the whiskey haze, you were halfway to supper, if you scored a seat. These weren't fancy restaurants with waiters and pretty menus, just splintered tables, wobbly chairs, and a long counter where you could eat, drink, and argue simultaneously. Regulars got barked at with choices like beans or stew, while newcomers got stared down like potential dine-and-dashers. That was saloon dining's charm, not about taste, but survival. You ate what they had, sat beside strangers who might rob or save you tomorrow, and if the food poisoned you, well, that's what whiskey was for. In the Wild West food chain, beans ruled supreme, not for flavor, but because they were cheap, indestructible, and could outlast gunfights and stampedes. Pinto, black, navy didn't matter. If it could be boiled into submission, it went in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, served morning, noon, and night to men who hadn't seen veggies since leaving civilization. Preparation was simple. 1. Dump beans in pot. 2. Boil for 6 hours over questionable fire. 3. Serve with salt pork, stale biscuits, and an apologetic shrug. Some cooks got fancy with lard or chili powder, but most couldn't be bothered. In the Wild West, seasoning was whatever blew in through the window. Beans fueled cattle drives, poker nights, and gave you something to chew while waiting for piano music or bar fights. The only downside, 1 cowboy eating beans was tolerable. 10 created biological warfare. Some brawls started not from insults, but from stealthy emissions near the stove. Still, beans were reliable. When meat ran out or chickens escaped, the humble bean remained. Some cowboys even used them as currency. Legend says one man bought a horse with 3-pound worth of salted beans and a promise never to return. Saloon food had highs and lows, but beans were the bedrock, the steady drumbeat of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't love him, you respected him, and sometimes that was enough. If beans were the soul of saloon cuisine, salt pork was its greasy backbone, slabs of meat so tough they could survive thunderstorms, bar fights, and 6 months in a saddlebag. This wasn't bacon, though cowboys pretended it was. Just pork belly salted into submission and preserved in brine that could season an ocean. Cooked right, it was tolerable, crispy and sizzling with enough crunch to make you forget the rest of your meal came from a can. Cooked wrong, like chewing a boot heel dipped in axle grease. Still, salt pork had fans, easy to transport, hard to ruin, though many tried, and gave flavor to bland beans. Cooks used every bit, fat for frying, rinds for stews, or unlucky newcomers who didn't know better. One bite taught you why barkeeps warned. Chew slow or choke proud. Sometimes the pork looked questionable. Greenish tints, funky smells. But saloons operated on one rule. Did it kill the last guy? If not, you ate it. Versatile too. Diced in beans, slapped on biscuits, or gnawed like jerky. Cowboys treasured it. Cooks relied on it when supplies ran low. Not healthy or elegant, but when your next hot meal might be 60 miles away, salt pork got the job done. Survive it, and you emerge stronger. In the Wild West, stew was the great equalizer. Hot, meaty-ish, and deeply suspicious. Every saloon served it because stew could disguise anything. Start with water, add beans or potatoes, then toss in whatever hadn't walked away. Beef, rabbit, squirrel, rattlesnake, if it stopped biting. One traveler swore he found a bootlace in his bowl, the most chewable part. Meat quality varied wildly. Maybe tender beef, maybe mystery meat. If the dog population dropped suddenly, you ate around the chewy bits and prayed. Veggies boiled into oblivion. Carrots became orange smudges. Onions vanished. Potatoes held out longest. The result? A brown-gray sludge that smelled better than it looked. Spices were luxuries. Most stews got flavor from whatever was on the cook's hands. Get black pepper? Fancy. Chili powder? Congratulations, your sinuses were about to get steam cleaned. But stew was comfort food, hot, filling, and stretchable by adding water. One pot might feed a dozen men or get reheated for days until it resembled glue. You didn't eat it for taste, but because it was there, the only edible thing in town unless you enjoyed chewing tobacco and regret. The golden rule? Never ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner. Now, not every saddle-sore cowboy could afford a slab of beef, but nearly every saloon kept something bread-like to sop up that questionable stew. These carb-loaded lifesavers came in two distinct forms: the heavenly fresh biscuit or its evil twin, hardtack. Let's start with the good stuff. When some miracle occurred and biscuits turned out right, a rare but glorious event, they emerged warm, buttery, and flaky enough to make a man believe he'd stumbled into paradise. Cooks who mastered biscuits became local legends, their secrets guarded like gold. Some swore by lard, others by buttermilk. A few probably just had low standards and lucky hands. These golden beauties served as edible spoons for beans or stew, perfect for mopping up every last drop of broth before it burned your tongue off. Typically baked in cast iron over open flames, they sometimes came with suspicious butter or, if you'd hit the jackpot, a drizzle of molasses. Then there was hardtack, the anti-biscuit. This flour and water abomination got baked until it could survive nuclear winter, originally designed for sailors and soldiers before invading the frontier. Its claim to fame? It never spoiled. Its curse? It barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack required strategy worthy of a military campaign. First, inspection for weevils, considered bonus protein, not a deal breaker. Then, the soaking ritual. Dunk it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened, a process taking anywhere from 10 minutes to next election cycle. Even then, chewing remained an upper body workout. Dentists probably made fortunes off cowboys who challenged hardtack and lost. But both biscuits and their sadistic cousin served their purpose: cheap, portable stomach fillers. In a world where calories trumped cuisine, they did the job. So if you wandered into some dust-choked saloon and saw steam rising from biscuits, you thank your lucky stars. If they slapped a hardtack hockey puck on your plate, well, at least you'd get a story and maybe a dental bill. Speaking of liquid courage, if you think today's coffee packs a punch, you've never tried cowboy coffee. A brew so strong it didn't just wake you up, it stared back with bloodshot eyes and dared you to blink. This wasn't some artisanal single-origin pour-over, just grounds, maybe, dumped in boiling water and tortured until the liquid turned black and developed opinions. The recipe? 1. Find water, preferably not downstream from the horses. 2. Throw in coffee grounds measured by instinct and desperation. 3. Boil until the spoon stands up by itself. No filters, no fancy gadgets, just pour and pray. The result? A thick, tar-like potion smelling of burnt dreams and tasting like divine retribution. That last sludge-filled sip often contained more grounds than liquid, delivering caffeine and fiber in one heroic gulp. Yet cowboys worshipped this liquid punishment. It warmed frozen desert mornings, powered night watches, cured hangovers, and helped digest whatever mystery meat lurked in the stew. It was fuel, comfort, and penance in one tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee, but when they did, it arrived scalding hot, probably stale and strong enough to strip paint. One cowboy described it as like drinking a mule's kick, adding you'd miss it when it was gone. Fancy types might add sugar or canned milk if available. Everyone else just grimaced and powered through. And if the pot had been reheating all day, you got the boldest brew known to man, thick as Texas crude and twice as bitter. Some thrifty cooks reused grounds, creating coffee that tasted like regret and broken promises, but it still counted. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure, you drank it to stay alive. Literally. When it came to meat in the Wild West, we're talking currency, status symbol, and sometimes a bravery test all in one. If your pockets were heavy with gold dust, you might order a steak, but what arrived depended entirely on the cook's mood, timing, and whether he liked your face. Steak was theoretically a luxury. Reality? Often a leathery slab of beef fried beyond recognition in lard, served without garnish or mercy. Request it medium rare, and the cook would stare until your mustache wilted. When fresh beef vanished, which was often, saloons got creative. Jerky, salted buffalo, venison, wild boar if someone got lucky hunting, meaning they hauled it back before the buzzards did. Mining towns saw even wilder options: squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast, jackrabbit surprise. Sometimes you ate meat without knowing what it was, a clear sign to chew quietly and ask no questions. If your steak required excessive chewing or revealed something resembling whiskers, you washed it down with whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your fate. Some meats had been aging so long they earned names. Cooks would slice off the green bits, drown the rest in gravy, and call it well-aged. If your dinner twitched when poked, you got one raised eyebrow of sympathy, nothing more. But on miraculous occasions when meat was fresh and the cook sober, you might get a real meal, sizzling beef with a fried egg on top, maybe even a biscuit. A plate reminding you why men survived gunfights for this. Mostly, though, you ate what was there and hoped it wouldn't eat you back. In saloons, dessert wasn't really a category, more like a happy accident when some cook took pity. But if comfort came, it usually wore the form of cornbread. Simple stuff: cornmeal, water or milk, lard, maybe baking powder if the cook remembered. This versatile staple could be baked, fried, or even dropped by spoonfuls into boiling stew if someone got lazy. Alone, it was dry and crumbly with slight sweetness depending on the maker. Always best fresh, which meant it was almost never fresh. More often you got a wedge hardened near the stove since sunrise, tough as a gambler's poker face. But here's where magic happened: molasses. This dark, sticky miracle transformed sad cornbread into something glorious. The cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, the gambler's last joy before losing his shirt. Affordable and shelf-stable, molasses masked even the driest baked goods sins. If a saloon had a barrel, you were golden. If they warmed it, five-star dining by frontier standards. Some cooks went further: molasses over skillet-fried cornbread with salt or spice. Not quite cake, but close enough after weeks of jerky and hardtack. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert: quick, cheap, filling, and sweet enough to calm nerves after gunfights or bad poker hands. No icing, no whipped cream, just gritty, grainy satisfaction. For men facing cattle drives, dust storms, and shootouts, dessert didn't need to sparkle. Just remind them not everything out west was trying to kill them. If you stumbled into a saloon before noon, sober and not bleeding, you might score eggs and chicken, either a miracle or a trap, depending on the day. Fresh eggs were gold in the Wild West. Not actual gold, but just as rare. Chickens weren't pets, but cranky, wandering theft targets. If a saloon had eggs, they either kept chickens or ran some back alley smuggling operation. What kind of eggs? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else. You didn't ask. You got what you got, maybe scrambled to disguise color, maybe fried until the yolks turned to leather. If your egg wobbled, that was God's way of saying, order whiskey instead. As for chicken, on menus, but not often. fried chicken usually meant some scrawny bird that died angry, tough, bony, and fried in lard until flavor surrendered. Not worth chewing, but it was meat, hot, and not beans again, so cowboys ate gratefully. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb or a quarter roasted over flames. Sometimes a feather in the gravy, just part of the charm. Breakfast eggs and chicken marked a saloon status, proof they served more than canned slop. If the eggs were warm and chicken not dry, you'd tell buddies for weeks. If it gave food poisoning, just the West reminding who's boss. Still, ordering eggs meant hope. They signaled morning, survival, and maybe living to drink another night. In saloons, pie wasn't just dessert, it was a statement. A steaming pie on the bar meant this joint meant business, that someone in back had put in real effort, practically a love letter in a land of bean slop and leathery meat. Don't get excited though. Wild West pie wasn't some perfect lattice-topped masterpiece with farm-fresh fruit. Just rustic, uneven crusts filled with canned or dried fruit, served lukewarm at best. Whipped cream, only if a cow followed you to town. Common varieties were apple, peach, or berry, a flexible category sometimes including raisins or things vaguely berry-like. Sweet-toothed cooks might add cinnamon. Others gave you crust, sugar, and optimism. Still, pie was a rare treat. Most cowboys hadn't seen one since leaving home. Saloons' new pie gave them an edge. A good slice could draw customers from 2 towns over. Warm, flaky pie? Someone might shoot over the last piece. Legends tell of poker games ending in gunfire over dessert disputes. Taking the last slice became valid grounds for violence, like cheating at cards. In a world where men got stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie approached sacred status. Not all pies were equal. Some were mostly crust, some experimental, some with fillings that might have been fruit in a past life. But when stars aligned, sober cook, hot oven, non-fermenting fruit, that pie became legendary. Because in the frontier's grit, a pie slice wasn't just food. It was hope served on a tin plate. Cheese in the Wild West was like a high-stakes poker game, full of risks, some bluffing, and a decent chance you'd regret your choices by sunrise. It did exist, sure, but you had to know where to look and possess the stomach of a mountain goat. Because frontier cheese wasn't some neatly packaged wheel from the general store, it was locally made, often by folks who'd read about dairy fermentation while 3 sheets to the wind. Most saloon cheese came in 2 terrifying varieties: the hard, yellow, suspiciously sweaty kind, or its soft, crumbly cousin that assaulted your nostrils. Refrigeration? That was a fairy tale. Unless winter had the place in an icy grip or the saloon sat near a cave, your cheese had usually developed its own personality by serving time. Might be cheddar, might be something vaguely Swiss, might just be a lump of dairy roulette with salt on top. If it squeaked when bitten, that was between you and your digestive system. Cheese typically appeared in chunks alongside bread, jerky, or if the stars aligned, a pickle. It helped cut through the saltiness of everything else and gave cowboys much-needed protein between brawls. The ambitious might melt it over beans or toast it on cornbread, assuming the cook felt artistic. But beware, some saloons took shortcuts. That cheese might be old butter gone rogue, or curdled milk pressed into shape and rolled in pepper to distract you. One traveling merchant swore he bought cheese in Nevada that tasted like boiled socks with a rind. He ate the whole thing anyway, because even bad cheese was still cheese. For saloons, offering any cheese at all was a flex, proof they had connections to a local farm or at least access to a cow that hadn't been rustled yet. This wasn't about flavor. It was a status symbol, a tiny flag of civilization in a land where most folks bathed with sand. So if your plate came with cheese, you poked it, sniffed it, tapped it with your fork, then ate it anyway. Because in the West, every meal came with a side of gamble. Now, if it could be pickled and forgotten in a jar, chances are some Wild West saloons served it. Pickling wasn't just about taste, it was survival strategy. Before refrigeration, saloon kitchens relied on vinegar's preserving power to keep food from crawling away. Vegetables, eggs, even meat, nothing escaped the sour embrace. Thus emerged pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers, the classic, crunchy, sharp, and occasionally still green. They appeared as sides, whiskey chasers, or just something to gnaw on between bad decisions. If lucky, they came fresh with garlic and spice. If not, tasted like rainwater and regret. Pickled eggs floated in cloudy jars behind bars like ghostly eyeballs, texture resembling sadness. Some cowboys swore by them. Quick protein, easy storage. Others swore at them. Pickled onions, common in mining towns, sharp enough to repel unwanted conversation. One bite, and you could clear a stampede. Even fruits got the treatment. Pickled peaches or pears created dishes both confusing and strangely addictive. Not quite dessert, not quite dinner, just wet, vinegary optimism. The beauty? Shelf life. Saloons could keep pickled goods for months, sometimes years. In a world where meat spoiled faster than a poker hand, this was priceless. But not all pickled items were equal. Sometimes jars weren't sealed right. Sometimes cooks experimented. Sometimes the pickled things stared back. Tales tell of men biting into pickled sausages to find bones, or labels reading, maybe pork. Still, pickled foods were part of the experience. Salty, sour, and strangely satisfying, like everything else that lasted out there. You didn't eat them for pleasure. You ate them because they probably wouldn't kill you. Probably. When food ran scarce, the kitchen closed, or the stew looked alive, cowboys turned to the most reliable menu item, whiskey. Always available, needing no prep, and in sufficient quantities, made you forget you were hungry, or that you'd just eaten mystery meat. Wild West whiskey wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by experts, just rough, raw, and often dangerous. Made from corn, rye, or whatever the barkeep had lying around, distilled in back rooms, barns, or bathtubs. The result? Liquid that could clean wounds, strip paint, and fuel fist fights. Some called it rock gut, others chain lightning, a few simply referred to it as lunch. When beans burned and bread molded, men drank their calories one fiery shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just booze, it was survival juice. It numbed trail dust pains, heartbreak, broken ribs, and questionable stew. One shot before duels, two after, three more while waiting to see if your bullet wound was serious. Some saloons served whiskey specials with beans or biscuits, not for flavor, but to keep you upright. Some madmen ordered whiskey with pickled eggs floating in it, counting as both hydration and protein. Whiskey was social glue too. You bought rounds to make friends, start fights, or apologize after both. A saloon's reputation hinged on how fast its whiskey knocked men off stools. Quality? Don't ask. Some whiskey was barely more than colored moonshine, spiked with tobacco juice or cayenne pepper. If it didn't burn going down, you might be drinking kerosene. Yet nobody complained. Whiskey was warm, cheap, and honest. The only menu item that never lied about what it was. On nights when dinner came in a glass with no fork or judgment, you raised it high and called it a meal. Behind every saloon's questionable food stood a shadowy figure whose power rivaled the bartenders, the cook. This smoke-shrouded individual, usually unshaven and permanently irritable, was either a culinary genius or a war criminal with no middle ground. You'd never see them smile, but you'd remember their cooking for days, either with gratitude or gastrointestinal trauma. Saloon cooks weren't trained chefs, more like ex-miners, ex-cons, or ex-somethings who knew how to build fires and weren't squeamish about mystery meat. Their kitchen, maybe a fire pit, dented stove, and a single cast iron pan that hadn't been washed since the gold rush. Yet somehow they fed entire saloons. On good days, they whipped up chili that brought tears, the good kind. Biscuits stayed warm, beans got cooked through, and cornbread carried just enough sweetness to remind you of home. Bad days. Scorched beans, gray meat, stew with an oil slick that moved when the pot stood still. You didn't complain, couldn't. Saloon etiquette was clear. Never insult the cook. Because the cook controlled everything. The salt, the grease, the meat-to-mystery ratio. If they liked you, you got the good cuts. If not, spoon scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into chili surprise. They doubled as unofficial bouncers too. Nobody wanted whacked by a ladle that just fried salt pork. A cleaver-wielding cook could clear a room faster than a shotgun. Despite their moods, these cooks were vital, keeping cowboys fed, miners conscious, and travelers from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked endless hours in heat and smoke, took seasoning insults, and lived by one rule. Don't like it? There's the door, or the whiskey. So whether they were your savior or saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook. Because in the Wild West, they held your stomach and your fate in their grease-stained hands. Now that we've explored the swinging doors, sniffed the stew, and stared down pickled eggs in foggy jars, the million-dollar question remains. Would you actually eat this stuff? Let's be real, modern taste buds might not survive the experience. The beans were basic, the meat a gamble, the stew more mystery than meal. You'd need ironclad digestion, cast iron teeth, and the appetite of a man who'd ridden 40 miles on an empty stomach. But here's the thing. For cowboys, miners, gamblers, and misfits of the frontier, saloon food wasn't about Michelin stars or Instagram plating. It was about fuel, calories, heat, something warm between gunfights or nights sleeping beside a mule named Regret. It was survival. You didn't ask about meat sources or complain if biscuits crumbled like chalk. You ate what landed before you, washing it down with something strong enough to kill bacteria or make you stop caring. When the food was good, when beans were fresh, coffee didn't bite back, and molasses graced the cornbread, it felt miraculous. So would you eat it? If you lived back then? Absolutely. You'd scrape the bowl clean, wipe the plate with bread crusts, and order seconds with coins that still smelled like dynamite. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook, toast with whiskey, and maybe, just maybe, end the night with pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous, it was greasy, gritty, and real. And in a world where the West was still wild, that was enough. The supper rush at the Lone Star Saloon always began with the scrape of boot heels against pine floors as shadows stretched long across Main Street. Dust motes danced in the last amber shafts of sunlight slicing through swinging doors, illuminating the nightly ritual about to unfold. Behind the bar, Gus, a former buffalo hunter missing 2 fingers, wiped down glasses with a rag that had seen better decades, his walrus mustache twitching as he cataloged tonight's offerings. "Stew's got meat today," he muttered to no one in particular, leastwise, "I reckon it's meat." Over by the pot-bellied stove, young Billy, a runaway from St. Louis with dishwater blonde hair and permanent soot smudges, stirred the cast iron cauldron with the concentration of an alchemist. The stew bubbled ominously, releasing steam that carried notes of pepper, regret, and something vaguely mammalian. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the door, fingers tightening around the spoon handle whenever new patrons entered. Last week, a trail hand had complained about finding a tooth in his bowl, and Billy still carried the bruise from where the man had adjusted his attitude. At table 6 near the back, Doc Henderson, who may or may not have actually been a doctor, methodically arranged his eating implements with the precision of a surgeon. His gnarled hands moved deliberately, folding a stained napkin just so, testing the edge of his Bowie knife against his thumb, positioning his tin cup at a perfect right angle to the table's edge. The ritual calmed him. Out here where the desert stole men's sanity grain by grain, small orderings mattered. When the biscuit basket landed before him with a thud, he examined each specimen like a prospector evaluating her samples, holding one up to the lamplight to assess structural integrity. Quit fondling the merchandise, Doc called Maisie, the evening's sole waitress, as she navigated the room with a tray balanced on her palm. Her calico dress swished around scuffed boots, the faded fabric telling its own story of near misses with coffee stains and grabby hands. She'd worked the floor long enough to read her room, knew which cowboys tipped in silver and which paid in trouble. Right now, her eyes kept darting toward the newcomers by the door, 3 dust-caked riders with the lean look of men who'd been chewing on disappointment for too long. The tallest of the trio, a redhead with a nose that had been broken more than once, sniffed the air like a hound catching scent. "Smells like someone died in here," he announced to his companions, grinning to show tobacco-stained teeth. His hand lingered near his colt as he surveyed the room, calculating who might be worth provoking. The saloon's regulars instinctively shifted, not away, but into readiness. Postures straightened beneath trail-worn jackets, calloused thumbs hooked casually into belt loops nearer to iron. At the counter, Old Man Peterson didn't even look up from his plate of salt pork and beans. His chewing maintained the same slow, rhythmic cadence it had for the past 20 minutes, each bite a small battle against the meat's resolve. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened as the newcomer's laughter grew louder. He'd seen this dance before, young bucks needing to prove themselves, usually at someone else's expense. His left hand drifted to the derringer in his vest pocket, just to confirm its presence, while his right continued the solemn work of sopping up gravy with a biscuit fragment. Back in the kitchen, the heat had reached infernal levels. Cookie, a grizzled ex-cavalry cook whose real name had been lost to time, wiped sweat from his brow with a bandana that might have been yellow once. The scar running from his right ear to collarbone ached in the humidity, an old reminder of how quickly dining disputes could escalate. He squinted at the latest batch of cornbread, judging its doneness by some internal calculus known only to him. Outside, the rising voices signaled trouble brewing faster than his coffee. With a practiced motion, he slid the cornbread from skillet to plank, then reached for the cleaver stuck in the overhead beam. Just in case. At table 3, the Dawson brothers conducted their weekly reconciliation over bowls of chili. Jed, the elder, stirred his portion absently, watching the red grease pool around the edges. "Ain't as good as Ma's," he murmured. "Not for the first time." His younger brother Clay didn't answer, just kept eating with the single-minded focus of a man who'd ridden hard all day. The familiar refrain hung between them, conjuring memories of a hearth now 500 miles and 2 years gone. Jed's throat worked as he swallowed against the sudden tightness. The chili wasn't half bad, really. Just needed more. Something. Home, maybe. Near the piano, currently unmanned since the last player had caught a bullet during Camptown races, a woman in a faded blue dress sat alone, turning a slice of dried apple pie on her plate with one finger. Eleanor had come west to teach school, but the cholera outbreak had other plans. Now she took in mending and avoided the stares of respectable women. The pie's crust flaked under her touch, releasing a faint scent of cinnamon that inexplicably brought tears to her eyes. She'd promised herself she wouldn't do this again, spend hard-earned coins on nostalgia served in a tin dish. Yet here she was, chasing the ghost of her mother's kitchen with every too sweet bite. The crash of an overturned chair shattered the moment. Red and his boys were making their move, circling Doc's table like wolves testing a steer. The old man didn't flinch when Red planted both hands on the scarred wood top, sending his careful place-setting askew. "Ain't you a little fancy for this dump?" Red sneered, reaching for Doc's untouched whiskey. The room held its breath. Even the flies seemed to pause mid-buzz. Then 3 things happened in quick succession. Doc's hand blurred upward. Red yelped as the Bowie knife pinned his sleeve to the table. Cookie appeared in the kitchen doorway, cleaver glinting. In the sudden silence, Doc's voice carried perfectly. "Son, I'd sooner part with my dignity than my dinner." A beat. Then Gus's guffaw erupted from behind the bar, triggering a wave of relieved laughter. Red's face flushed the color of his hair as he worked the knife free. The tension bled away into the floorboards as the would-be tough guys slunk toward the exit, their hunger for trouble outweighed by hunger proper. By lamplight's glow, the saloon's evening symphony resumed, the clink of cutlery, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. Billy emerged from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, his shoulders losing their defensive hunch. At the counter, Peterson finally looked up from his plate, nodding once to Doc in quiet approval. Cookie returned to his domain, cleaver back in its place, but within easy reach. Somewhere in the night, a coyote yipped, its voice carrying across the prairie to where other lights burned in other windows, other souls taking comfort where they could find it. Because that's what these meals were, beneath the toughness and the tall tales, not just sustenance, but sanctuary. However brief, however imperfect. The steak might be tough, the coffee bitter, the company questionable. But for this hour, with plates full and bellies warming, the wilderness beyond those swinging doors could wait. Tomorrow would bring dust and danger enough. Tonight, there was stew. There was bread. There was, against all odds, still grace to be found in the getting by. The morning after a saloon brawl always smelled different than regular mornings. There was the usual with smoke and bacon grease, sure, but underneath lingered the metallic tang of blood not quite scrubbed from floorboards, the sour note of spilled whiskey soaking into oak, and that peculiar acridness that came from gunpowder residue mixing with egg yolks. Young Billy knelt near the piano, scrubbing at a dark stain with lye soap that made his eyes water, trying not to think too hard about whether it was tobacco juice or something more vital. Breakfast service would start soon, and Cookie didn't tolerate delays or squeamishness. Out in the pre-dawn chill, the town's early risers were already lining up outside the Lone Star's kitchen door where Cookie sold breakfast parcels to those who couldn't afford or weren't welcome inside. Miners with hollow eyes and dirt permanently etched into their cuticles shifted from foot to foot, their breath making ghosts in the cold air. Each clutched a coin or two, saved from last night's wages before the whiskey and faro tables could claim them. The parcel, a wax paper bundle containing 2 corn dodgers, a slice of salt pork, and if the stars aligned, a hard-boiled egg, represented the difference between collapsing mid-shift or making it to lunch. Inside the kitchen, Cookie worked with the efficiency of a man who'd fed armies. His hands, scarred from decades of grease burns, moved with surprising delicacy as he flipped corn cakes on the griddle. The cast iron skillet had been seasoning since the Buchanan administration, its blackened surface slick with rendered fat that popped and hissed like an angry rattlesnake. Every few minutes, he'd glance at the coffee pot bubbling on the stove's back corner, judging its readiness by some internal clock known only to him. Too weak, and the miners would complain. Too strong, and they'd claim it stripped paint. Getting it just right was an alchemy he'd mastered through years of trial and error. At the long counter, Billy's sister Mary cracked eggs into a mixing bowl with one hand while using the other to fend off the advances of the kitchen cat, a battle-scarred Tom named Beans who considered any unattended food his rightful tribute. The eggs varied wildly in color, some almost orange with freshness from the Widow Hawkins hens, others pale and watery from being held too long. Mary didn't discriminate. She learned early that hunger wasn't picky. As she whisked, her eyes kept darting to the small mirror propped above the sink, angled just so to watch the front door's reflection. Last night's troublemakers might return, and she'd promised their mother she'd keep Billy out of harm's way. Out front, the first proper customers of the day began trickling in, storekeepers needing coffee before unlocking their shops, hungover ranch hands seeking hair of the dog, and the occasional soiled dove still wearing last night's paint, her smile tired around the edges. They all nodded to Old Pete, who occupied the same corner table every morning with his chessboard and a bowl of oatmeal that he attacked with more strategy than some generals brought to battle. Rumor said he'd been a mathematics professor back east before. Well, before whatever brought him out here. Now he measured his life in coffee spoons and the rare opponent who could last more than 6 moves. The morning's first crisis came when the biscuit runner, a half-Cherokee boy called Jumper, slipped in the alley and sent 24 fresh-baked beauties tumbling into the dirt. Cookie took one look at the salvaged goods, now more gravel than flour, and sighed so deeply his suspenders quivered. "Ain't the first time dirt's been the main seasoning," he muttered, brushing off the least offensive specimens. The biscuits would still get served, just with extra chewing required. Waste not, want not, especially when the next supply wagon wasn't due for a week. As the breakfast rush hit its stride, the saloon transformed into a study in contrasts. At one table, cattle baron Richard Kingsley dined on steak and eggs with real silverware, his napkin tucked precisely into his collar. 2 tables over, a pair of mule skinners ate sowbelly and beans straight from the skillet, using pocket knives as utensils. Neither group acknowledged the other, though Kingsley's nostrils flared slightly at the Skinners' liberal use of tobacco juice. The unspoken rules of the West held firm. Money might buy better cuts of meat, but it didn't buy respect, and every man's hunger weighed the same on the scales of human need. Back in the kitchen, Mary portioned out the last of the molasses with a practiced hand, making sure each biscuit got just enough sweetness to feel like a treat, but not so much as to invite greed. She learned the art of equitable distribution during the lean winter of '78, when Cookie had stretched 2 pounds of sugar across 3 weeks. The memory of those hungry months still made her hands shake sometimes, though she'd never admit it. Now she took quiet pride in ensuring no one left the Lone Star's table feeling cheated, even if the portions sometimes ran small. Mid-morning brought the stagecoach stop, and with it, 15 minutes of controlled chaos as passengers rushed in seeking quick sustenance before the next leg of their journey. The drummer, a slick-haired fellow selling elixirs guaranteed to cure everything from consumption to cowardice, made the mistake of complaining about his egg's doneness. Cookie fixed him with a stare that could curdle milk until the man stammered an apology and ate every rubbery bite. Travelers came and went, but reputation stuck. And Cookie's reputation included a low tolerance for culinary criticism from men who couldn't tell sagebrush from saffron. By noon, the breakfast crowd had thinned, leaving behind a debris field of crumpled napkins, egg-smeared plates, and coffee rings that would become part of the table's patina. Billy moved through the room with a bus tub, collecting the detritus of 100 small human dramas. In one corner booth, he found a love note tucked beneath a saucer. In another, a derringer left behind like a forgotten promise. Both would go into the lost and found box behind the bar, where such items accumulated until claimed or forgotten. As the clock ticked toward lunch service, the saloon's rhythm shifted again. Cookie began the day's soup, throwing in yesterday's bread heels, some questionable carrots, and the better-looking bits of beef from last night's roast. Mary inventoried the remaining supplies while fending off Bean's increasingly bold attempts at theft. Out front, Gus polished the bar to a dull shine, occasionally glancing at the shotgun mounted beneath the counter, just in case. And so the cycle continued, as it had for years and would for years more, hunger arriving as regular as sunrise, met with whatever ingenuity and grit the kitchen could muster. The food might be simple, the company rough, and the circumstances far from civilized. But in this place, at this hour, with the midday sun painting golden squares on the worn floorboards, there existed something like peace. The kind of peace that comes not from absence of struggle, but from shared perseverance. The peace of full bellies and the promise that, whatever the afternoon might bring, there would be supper waiting when it was done. The moment the clock struck 12, the Lone Star Saloon transformed from a sleepy breakfast haunt into a churning hive of hunger and hustle. The lunch rush wasn't just a meal, it was a spectacle, a daily performance where every player knew their role, and the stakes were as high as a gambler's last silver dollar. At the center of it all stood Cookie, his apron splattered with the morning's grease and grime, his cleaver already in hand as he surveyed the battlefield. The kitchen's heat had climbed to unbearable levels, the air thick with the scent of frying onions, seared meat, and the ever-present tang of whiskey that never quite washed out of the floorboards. He wiped his brow with a sleeve that had seen better days and barked at Billy, who was frantically stacking tin plates like a man preparing for siege. "Move, boy. Them miners ain't gonna feed themselves." Billy scrambled, his arms loaded with bowls, his mind racing faster than his feet. He'd learned the hard way that hesitation meant a boot to the backside, or worse, a mistip from some impatient cowboy who didn't take kindly to slow service. Out in the dining area, the tables filled faster than a poker pot on payday. Ranch hands fresh from the range, their faces still streaked with dust, elbowed for space beside town clerks who fancied themselves above such rowdy company. The noise was deafening boot stomping, chairs scraping, voices rising in a cacophony of orders, complaints, and the occasional burst of laughter that cut through the chaos like a gunshot. At table 3, a group of cattle drivers hunched over their meals like wolves over a fresh kill. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, shoveling beans and cornbread into their mouths with barely a pause for breath. One of them, a wiry fellow with a scar across his knuckles, grunted in approval as he sopped up the last of his gravy with a crust of bread. "Ain't half bad today," he muttered, though no one was listening. Near the bar, a traveling salesman in a suit that had seen better decades poked suspiciously at a stew, his nose wrinkling as he extracted a piece of gristle with his fork. He glanced around, as if expecting sympathy, but found none. The regulars ignored him, their own meals disappearing with the speed of men who knew hunger intimately. "Eat it or leave it," Gus growled from behind the counter, his eyes never leaving the whiskey bottle he was filling. "Ain't running a fancy hotel." The salesman sighed and took a tentative bite, his expression caught between resignation and regret. Back in the kitchen, Mary worked the fry station with the precision of a gunslinger. Her hands moved in a blur, flipping steaks, cracking eggs, dodging the occasional grease splash with reflexes honed by years of near misses. Beans the cat lurked beneath her feet, waiting for any morsel that might escape her watchful eye. "You drop it, I eat it," he seemed to say, his tail flicking with anticipation. The real test came when the stagecoach rolled in, disgorging a fresh wave of hungry travelers. They burst through the doors in a flurry of luggage and complaints, their eyes scanning the room for an open seat like prospectors searching for gold. The regulars groaned, outsiders meant longer waits, tighter quarters, and the inevitable clash of manners between those who lived by the land and those just passing through. One newcomer, a dandy in a bowler hat, made the mistake of trying to claim old Pete's usual spot. The room fell silent as Pete looked up from his chessboard, his gaze steady as a rifle's sight. "That chair's spoken for," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a man who didn't repeat himself. The dandy hesitated, then wisely retreated to a corner table, where he spent the rest of his meal eyeing the exits. By the time the last plate was cleared and the final coffee cup drained, the saloon exhaled. The noon rush was over, leaving behind a trail of crumbs, spilled beer, and the occasional forgotten hat. Billy slumped against the kitchen door, his shirt damp with sweat, his feet aching. Cookie clapped him on the shoulder, a rare grin splitting his grizzled face. "You lived. Now get them dishes scrubbed, supper ain't gonna wait." And just like that, the cycle began anew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the saloon's dusty windows in shades of burnt orange and deep violet, the Lone Star prepared for its most dangerous shift, supper. Nightfall in the Wild West didn't just bring darkness. It brought out the kind of hunger that couldn't be satisfied by beans alone. It brought men who'd spent 12 hours in the saddle, their tempers as frayed as their bootlaces. It brought gamblers looking for a hot meal before a cold game of poker. And, if the stars aligned wrong, it brought trouble, the kind that ended with chairs smashed over backs and Colt revolvers clearing leather. In the kitchen, Cookie wiped down his cleaver with the solemnity of a gunslinger cleaning his six-shooter. The supper rush was war, and he was its general. "All right, you maggots," he barked at Billy and Mary, who stood at attention like raw recruits. "Steaks running low, the potatoes got eyes bigger than mine, and if I catch either of you wasting lard again, I'll tan your hides." "Understood." They nodded. No one argued with Cookie after sundown. Out front, Gus lit the oil lamps, their flickering glow casting long shadows across the scarred wooden floors. He adjusted the shotgun beneath the bar, just in case, and lined up the whiskey bottles like soldiers awaiting inspection. The night crowd wasn't like the breakfast regulars or the lunchtime laborers. These men came with coins in their pockets and devils on their shoulders. The first wave arrived like a storm front. Miners fresh from the claims, their faces still streaked with dirt, their knuckles raw from swinging picks. They didn't sit so much as collapse into chairs, their bodies aching, their bellies empty. "What's edible?" One growled, slapping his palm on the table hard enough to make the cutlery jump. Gus didn't blink. "Everything's edible once." Over at table 7, a trio of cowboys fresh off a cattle drive hunched over their plates like they were guarding gold. Their hands moved fast, too fast for polite company, shoveling food into their mouths with the urgency of men who'd spent weeks eating nothing but trail dust and regret. One of them, a lanky redhead with a chipped tooth, paused just long enough to scowl at his beans. "These got more grit than a desert wind," he muttered. His companion, a grizzled old-timer with a beard like tumbleweed, didn't look up from his meal. "Chew slower. Maybe you'll taste something besides your own," complaining Dot. The saloon's swinging doors burst open, and in strode the evening's wild card, a gambler in a tailored coat that had seen better days, his fingers adorned with rings that might have been gold or might have been brass. He took a seat at the bar with the ease of a man who owned the place, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Whiskey, and whatever's left of that steak." Gus slid a glass across the counter. "Steak's extra." The gambler's grin didn't waver. "So's my patience." A hush fell over the room. Even the miners paused mid-chew. Then laughter. Loud, raucous, the kind that made the oil lamps tremble. The tension shattered like a dropped whiskey bottle, and the saloon's usual clamor resumed, louder than before. Back in the kitchen, Mary cursed as she pulled a pan of cornbread from the oven, the heat blasting her face like a desert wind. Beans the cat wove between her ankles, his yellow eyes fixed on the golden crust with murderous intent. "Not for you," she hissed, swatting him away with her apron. The cat flicked his tail, unconvinced. At the far end of the room, a group of ranch hands started a drinking song, their voices rough but surprisingly harmonious. The lyrics weren't fit for polite company, but then, neither was the Lone Star. The gambler joined in, his tenor cutting through the bass rumble of the cowboys like a knife through butter. For a moment, just a moment, the saloon felt less like a battleground and more like a home. Then the shooting started. It was just a warning shot, some drunk fool letting off steam, but it was enough to send plates clattering and men diving for cover. Gus had the shotgun halfway to his shoulder before he realized it was just young Billy, who'd accidentally knocked over a chair while carrying a tray. The gunshot had been a beer bottle hitting the floor. Silence. Then uproarious laughter. Cookie emerged from the kitchen, his cleaver glinting in the lamplight. Next idiot who spooks my customers gets served as tomorrow's special. Understood. The message was received. By the time the last drunk was tossed out and the final dish washed, the saloon stood quiet, its floors sticky with spilled beer, its air thick with the ghosts of 100 stories told and forgotten. Cookie leaned against the bar, a mug of something strong in his hand. We lived. Gus nodded. Same time tomorrow? Same time tomorrow. And so the cycle continued. The wind howled through Rattlesnake Gulch, carrying red dust that stuck to the sweat on Billy Crawford's neck. Behind him, the Lone Star Saloon sign creaked on rusted chains, its faded lettering barely visible beneath decades of grime. At 16, Billy knew every splinter in the bar top, every stain on the floorboards, especially the dark one near table 3 where Sheriff Thompson took a bullet last summer. Quit picking at that and fetch the whiskey. Gus's voice cut through the smoky air as he polished glasses with a rag grayer than his beard. In the kitchen, Cookie's cleaver thunked rhythmically into cutting board. The usual aroma of seared meat had been replaced by something sharper, vinegar and saltpeter. Billy recognized the smell from last winter's bandit siege. It meant trouble was coming, and Cookie was preserving what meat they had left. A shadow filled the doorway. The man stood 6'4" in worn cavalry boots, his duster streaked with alkali dust. When he removed his hat, the lamplight revealed a face like sun-cracked leather, bisected by a scar running from hairline to jaw. Whiskey. The stranger's voice rasped like a dull saw on bone. And whatever's left of that beef, I smell burning. Gus didn't reach for the bottle. We're fresh out of hospitality, friend. The stranger's fingers tapped a rhythm on his colt. 3 quick, 2 slow. Billy's throat went dry. That was Quantrill's raid cadence, the calling card of the Redfield gang. Over by the cold stove, old Pete abandoned his chessboard, hand drifting toward the derringer in his vest. Mary paused mid-pour, her knuckles whitening around the coffee pot. Even Beans the cat stopped stalking the kitchen mice, fur rising along his spine. The stranger smiled, revealing a gold-capped canine. Now that's no way to treat a paying customer. He flipped a double eagle onto the bar. The coin spun with a high, clear ring before settling next to Billy's trembling fingers. Cookie's cleaver went silent. In that stillness, Billy heard the telltale creak of floorboards out back. Too heavy for coyotes, too furtive for honest men. The Redfield gang never rode alone. Gus finally reached for the whiskey. As amber liquid splashed into a glass, the stranger leaned close enough for Billy to smell tobacco and gun oil. You look like a smart boy, he murmured. How'd you like to earn another one of those coins? Outside, a nightjar's call cut off abruptly. The saloon's lanterns flickered as the front door swung open again. This time, the figure standing there wore a tin star. Evening, gentlemen. Sheriff Calloway's drawl was deceptively mild as he rested one hand on his holster. Heard there was a reunion happening. The stranger's grin didn't reach his eyes. Why, Sheriff? Fancy meeting you in a den of thieves. The saloon's oil lamps flickered as Sheriff Calloway took 3 measured steps inside, his spurs jingling like rattlesnake warnings. Dust motes swirled in the slice of moonlight cutting through the doorway, illuminating the sweat beading on Billy's upper lip. Now, Eli, the sheriff said, tipping his hat back with one finger. Last I heard, you were supposed to be rotting in Yuma Penitentiary. The stranger, Eli Redfield, chuckled and raised his whiskey glass in mock salute. Prison food didn't agree with my digestion, Sheriff. His gold tooth caught the light as he took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact. Billy's fingers crept toward the gutting knife strapped to his thigh. He'd never drawn it on a man before, but the way Eli's gang was surrounding the building, he could feel their presence like static before lightning. Left little choice. Cookie's voice boomed from the kitchen. You spill blood in my establishment, you clean it with your shirt. The cleaver thunked into wood for emphasis. Eli set down his glass with exaggerated care. No need for dramatics. I'm just here to collect what's owed. From his duster pocket, he produced a yellowed slip of paper that made the sheriff's jaw tighten. Mary gasped. Billy craned to see the document, a deed signed in faded ink. granting mineral rights to one Elias Redfield for all lands west of the Pecos. That's a forgery, Sheriff Calloway snapped, hand now fully on his revolver. The McCready family owned those claims fair and until a Union patrol burned their ranch in '64. Eli interrupted, smile vanishing. My brother died defending that land. Now the railroad's coming through, and I aim to be compensated. A floorboard creaked near the back entrance. Billy caught movement through the kitchen's bullet holes, at least 3 shadows shifting position outside. His pulse hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sheriff's voice dropped to a dangerous purr. You're talking about stealing from widows and orphans, Eli. That mineral survey belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. Eli's fingers resumed their tapping. 3 quick, 2 slow, on the Colt's grip. Old Pete chose that moment to cough violently, his derringer now conspicuously absent from its usual vest pocket. The gambler at table 7 quietly palmed a steak knife. Even Beans the cat had positioned himself near Eli's boot, tail lashing. Then the lanterns went out. Blackness swallowed the saloon whole. Billy froze, gunpowder and cheap whiskey stinging his nostrils, as the darkness rang with the sound of steel being drawn. Someone's elbow knocked a bottle off the bar. It shattered like a gunshot against the floorboards. Nobody moved. Sheriff Calloway's command cut through the chaos, but Billy was already dropping behind the counter. His knee landed in something wet, spilled beer or blood. He couldn't tell, as he fumbled for the shotgun Gus kept beneath the cash drawer. A match flared near table 7. In its brief glow, Billy saw the gambler's face twisted in a snarl, steak knife gleaming. Then darkness swallowed them again as the match burned down to the gambler's fingertips. He cursed and shook it out. Light the damn lamps. Cookie bellowed from the kitchen. A metallic clang followed, the sound of his cleaver being thrown like a tomahawk. It struck the wall with a thunk that meant business. Billy's fingers closed around cold iron, the shotgun's twin barrels. He'd loaded it himself that morning with salt and nails, the way Gus had taught him. His thumb found the hammers as boot steps scuffed toward the bar. Easy there, boy. Eli's whiskey-rough voice came from directly above him. That scattergun makes a mess neither of us wants cleaned up. The saloon doors burst open. Moonlight silhouetted 3 figures. Eli's gang, shotguns leveled. Billy's breath hitched as he recognized the tallest one, lanky Jim Turpin, who'd strung up homesteaders in the Lincoln County War. Evening, gents. Jim's nasal twang set Billy's teeth on edge. Heard there was a party. A gun cocked, the sheriff's Colt. Last warning, Eli. Then the world exploded in light and sound. Mary screamed as a lantern flared to life behind the bar. Billy blinked against the sudden glare to see Gus holding the lamp high, his other hand wrapped around Eli's wrist, forcing the outlaw's pistol toward the ceiling. The gambler from table 7 had lanky Jim in a headlock, steak knife pressed to his jugular. But it was Cookie who commanded the room. He stood barehanded in the kitchen doorway, blood dripping from a cut above his eye where a stray bullet had grazed him. In the flickering light, he looked like some ancient warrior carved from oak and iron. Enough. The single word silenced the room. Cookie pointed to the deed still clutched in Eli's hand. That paper's worth less than the spit holding it together. The McCready boy works my kitchen. Every head turned toward Billy, who realized with dawning horror what Cookie had just revealed. The mineral rights, the land Eli was killing for, belonged to him. The lantern's glow pooled like molten gold across the bar top, catching the fine tremors in Billy's hands as he clutched the shotgun. Dust motes swirled in the sudden silence, each particle suspended like the moment between lightning and thunder. Behind the counter, his knees pressed into the rough pine floorboards where generations of spilled liquor had left the wood permanently tacky. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the sour mash aroma rising from the soaked-in stains beneath him. Mary's breath came in short, audible hitches from the corner where she'd flattened herself against the pie safe. Her calico dress sleeve had caught on a nail, the fabric stretched taut as her shoulders. One hand covered her mouth, whether to stifle a scream or hold in the bile rising at the sight of lanky Jim's bulging eyes under the gambler's blade. Billy couldn't tell. At table 7, The chess pieces lay scattered where old Pete had overturned the board in his haste to draw. A rook rolled slowly in a half circle before settling against a bouthiel, the gambler's expensive leather shoe now crusted with trail mud and something darker. The man himself had sweat cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face, his knife hand steady, even as his left eyelid twitched like a horse flicking flies. Eli Redfield's nostrils flared as his gaze locked onto Billy. The outlaw's pupils had swallowed the blue of his irises whole, black and depthless as a mine shaft. Billy could see the exact moment recognition struck, the slight parting of chapped lips, the unconscious flexing of gun-calloused fingers above his holster. That gold-capped tooth gleamed when he exhaled through his nose, the sound whistling faintly like wind through a bullet hole. McCready. The name left Eli's mouth like a curse and a prayer tangled together. His duster creaked as he shifted weight, spurs chinking softly, the only sound except for Beans the cat's low growl from beneath the stove. The tomcat's fur stood erect along his spine, his tail thrashing against the cast iron legs with rhythmic thumps that echoed Billy's pounding heartbeat. Sheriff Calloway's boot scraped deliberately against the floorboards near the door. "That boy's under my protection," he said, each word measured as grains of powder in a cartridge. The sheriff's sun-browned hand hadn't moved from his Colt, but Billy noticed his thumb now rested lightly on the hammer, a subtle shift from warning to promise. Behind Eli, one of the gang members, a pockmarked kid no older than Billy, swallowed hard enough to make his Adam's apple bob. His shotgun barrel dipped slightly as his gaze darted between the sheriff and Cookie's blood-streaked face. The kitchen doorway framed Cookie like a portrait, his massive shoulders blocking the firelight so that his silhouette burned orange at the edges. A single drop of blood fell from his chin, splattering onto the deed still clutched in Eli's hand. The droplet spread through the aged paper like whiskey through sand, blurring the inked letters that supposedly gave Eli rights to the McCready copper veins. Billy's throat constricted as memories surfaced, his father's work-worn hands unfolding a nearly identical map at their homestead table, the way Pa would trace the vein lines with a fingertip blackened from her samples. Lanky Jim chose that moment to whimper against the gambler's blade. The sound seemed to fracture the frozen moment. Eli's eyes flickered toward his trapped man, then back to Billy. Something calculating moved behind those dark pupils. Not mercy, but the cold arithmetic of a man weighing risks against rewards. Outside, a coyote's howl lifted into the night, the cry stretching thin before shattering into yips. The wind answered, hissing through the bullet holes in the saloon's clapboard walls. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot of coffee began to boil over, the hiss and spit of liquid hitting flames cutting through the tension like a knife through scar tissue. Billy realized three things at once. The shotgun in his hands was still uncocked. Eli's finger had crept inside his Colt's trigger guard. Mary was mouthing words at him from across the room. The cellar. Then the deed in Eli's hand burst into flames. The burning deed flared like a struck match in Eli's hand, its edges curling into blackened petals. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire saloon watched the flames lick upward, illuminating the sweat-slicked planes of Eli's face, the whites of the pockmarked kid's widened eyes, the way Sheriff Calloway's trigger finger tensed ever so slightly. Then chaos erupted. Billy threw himself sideways as Eli's Colt roared, the bullet splintering the whiskey shelf behind him. Glass rained down in a glittering cascade, dousing the lantern Gus held. Darkness swallowed the room again, broken only by muzzle flashes that strobed the scene in jagged snapshots. Mary yanking open the cellar door, her calico sleeve tearing completely free. The gambler's steak knife flashing as Lanky Jim twisted in his grip. Old Pete's derringer appearing like magic in his palm, its tiny barrel swinging toward Eli. Billy's shoulder hit the floor hard, the shotgun skittering from his grasp. He tasted blood, he'd bitten his tongue, and the copper tang mixed with the acrid gun smoke now choking the air. His fingers scrambled across sticky floorboards until they closed around the shotgun's warm barrel. Down! Cookie's bellow shook the rafters. Billy barely flattened himself in time. Cookie's cleaver whirred overhead like a vengeful hawk, embedding itself in the chest of the pockmarked kid with a wet thunk. The young outlaw gasped, his shotgun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as he crumpled, sending down a shower of wood splinters. Eli fired again, this time at the sheriff. The bullet grazed Calloway's ear before burying itself in the door jamb. The sheriff returned fire, his Colt's report deafening in the enclosed space. Eli staggered back, clutching his side, his gold tooth gleaming in a rictus of pain. Through the smoke, Billy saw Mary gesturing frantically toward the cellar. The heavy door stood ajar, revealing darkness below. His muscles tensed to crawl toward it when a hand closed like a bear trap around his ankle. Not so fast, McCready. Lanky Jim's breath reeked of rotten teeth as he dragged Billy backward. The gambler lay unconscious nearby, his fancy coat darkening with blood from a head wound. Billy kicked wildly, his boot connecting with something soft. Lanky Jim grunted, but didn't let go. His free hand drew a Bowie knife from his belt, the blade's edge serrated from sharpening on prison stones. Then Beans the cat became a snarling comet, launching himself at Lanky Jim's face. The outlaw howled as claws raked his cheeks, momentarily loosening his grip. Billy twisted free, scrambling toward the cellar on hands and knees. Behind him, the saloon had become a nightmare diorama. Gus trading shotgun blasts with the remaining gang members through the shattered front window. Cookie wielding a cast iron skillet like a mace, driving Eli toward the door. Old Pete methodically reloading his Derringer behind an overturned table. Billy reached the cellar steps just as another bullet whined past his ear. He tumbled downward into cool darkness, the wooden stairs groaning under his weight. His last glimpse of the saloon showed Mary slamming the cellar door shut, her face a pale oval of determination, before the lock engaged with a decisive click. Silence. Darkness. Then from above, the unmistakable sound of a coal oil lamp shattering against the floorboards. Heat bloomed instantly. Through the cracks in the ceiling, Billy saw the first tongues of fire begin their hungry dance. The Lone Star Saloon was burning, and he was trapped beneath it. The darkness in the cellar was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed against Billy's eyeballs. His outstretched fingers brushed rough stone walls as he crawled forward, each breath tasting of damp earth and aged whiskey from the shattered barrels above. Somewhere in the blackness, water dripped with metronomic precision, plink, 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 like a spectral clock counting down to some unknown doom. A muffled explosion shook the floorboards overhead. Dust sifted down, coating Billy's tongue with the chalky bitterness of powdered adobe. He spat, the sound shockingly loud in the confined space. The saloon's foundation beams groaned like dying men as fire consumed them. Then, light. A faint blue glow pulsed from a crack in the far wall. Billy blinked, his pupils contracting painfully. The light wasn't from the fire above. It came from deeper within the earth, flickering like foxfire in a peat bog. He moved toward it, his boots crunching on something brittle. Kneeling, his fingers encountered smooth curves and jagged edges, bones. Not animal. Human. A skeletal hand still clutching a rusted pickaxe. The realization struck like a lightning bolt. This was no ordinary cellar. The Lone Star had been built over an abandoned mine shaft. The blue glow intensified as Billy squeezed through the crevice. The tunnel beyond sloped sharply downward, its walls shored up with rotting timbers that wept black sap. The air grew colder with each step, his breath now visible as pale vapor. 50 paces in, the shaft opened into a cavern where the source of the light became clear veins of raw copper or streaking through the rock, their metallic surfaces catching some distant fire's glow to create an eerie bioluminescence. And at the cavern's heart stood a figure. Sheriff Calloway leaned against a support beam, his shirt dark with blood. In his hands he cradled a leather-bound ledger, its pages fluttering in some unfelt breeze. "You took your damn time, boy," the lawman wheezed. "Been waiting since the fire started." Billy's voice emerged as a croak. "How did you?" "Trapdoor behind the bar. Gus showed me years ago." The sheriff lifted the ledger. "Your pa's records. Proves the McCready claim predates Eli's forgery by a decade." Above them, another beam collapsed with a thunderous crash. Dust rained down as the sheriff continued calmly. "There's a tunnel leads to the old livery. Take this to Judge Wilkins in Silver City. But the gang, Cookie's handling it. A ghost of a smile touched Calloway's lips. That old bastard kept his army revolver loaded with .44 Russians. Eli won't know what hit him. The ground trembled. Somewhere in the darkness, rock grated against rock as the ancient timbers protested their centuries-old burden. Go. The sheriff shoved the ledger into Billy's hands. And don't look back. As Billy turned toward the tunnel's yawning mouth, the last thing he heard was Calloway humming Streets of Laredo, off-key but cheerful, before the mountain swallowed the sound whole. The tunnel's air grew thicker with each staggering step, pressing against Billy's lungs like a weight. The ledger's leather cover stuck to his sweating palms as he ran, its pages fluttering against his chest like the wings of a panicked bird. Behind him, the groan of collapsing timbers echoed through the shaft, a sound like the earth itself dying in slow motion. A sudden fork in the tunnel forced Billy to skid to a halt. To the left, faint daylight seeped through cracks in a boarded-up exit. To the right, the distant orange flicker of fire reflected off wet stone, the saloon collapsing into the mines below. His boot soles slipped on something slick as he veered left, not water, but a dark liquid seeping from the walls. When he touched his fingers to it, they came away rust-red. The mountain was bleeding iron. The boarded exit resisted at first, nails screeching in protest as Billy threw his shoulder against the rotten wood. With a final crack, it gave way, sending him tumbling into the blinding white light of midday. He landed hard in the livery stable's manure pile, the stench overwhelming after the mineral tang of the mine. Chaos greeted him. The entire town seemed to be running toward the saloon, buckets sloshing water that steamed when it hit the flames. Through gaps in the crowd, Billy caught glimpses of the Lone Star's roof caving inward in a shower of sparks. His heart lurched. Mary had been upstairs when the fire started. Then he saw her. Mary stood by the horse trough, her dress sleeves gone entirely now, arms bare and blistered from carrying buckets. She was shouting orders at a group of miners, her voice hoarse but steady. When she turned, their eyes met across the chaos. Something unspoken passed between them. Relief, terror, determination, before she gave a sharp nod toward the mountains west of town. A hand clamped onto Billy's shoulder. He whirled, fist raised, only to find old Pete breathing hard, his chessboard still tucked under one arm. The old man's eyes were bloodshot from smoke, but his grip was iron. Judge Wilkins ain't in Silver City, Pete wheezed. Wrote him this morning for the Henderson trial. He pressed a key into Billy's palm, the one that unlocked the strong box under his bunk. Take the bay mare. Eli's got men watching the west road. As if summoned by the mention, gunfire cracked from the direction of the smithy. A bullet whined off the livery's doorframe, sending splinters biting into Billy's cheek. He didn't need to see the shooter to know Eli's gang had survived the fire. Old Pete shoved him toward the stalls. Go, boy. That ledger's worth more in gold now. The bay mare sensed Billy's panic, her ears flattening as he threw the saddle on bareback. Another bullet shattered the lantern above him, raining glass and kerosene. The mare reared, but Billy held on, swinging onto her back with the ledger clamped under one arm. As they burst from the stable, the full horror of the burning saloon came into view. Flames licked from every window, the painted lady on the whiskey sign now a screaming wraith in the smoke. Near the porch, Cookie stood like a monolith, his apron aflame, both hands wrapped around his massive Colt. At his feet lay three bodies, Eli's men, and beyond them, Eli himself, on his knees in the dirt, one hand pressed to his bloodied side. Even from 20 yards, Billy could see the madness in his eyes as he raised his pistol toward Cookie. The gunshot, when it came, wasn't from Eli's Colt. It came from the sheriff's office across the street, a single, perfect rifle report that spun Eli sideways into the dust. On the saloon's porch steps, Gus lowered the Sharp's buffalo rifle, his face a mask of soot and grief. Then the saloon's roof collapsed with a roar, sending a firestorm of sparks spiraling into the sky. The bay mare bolted, and Billy let her run, toward the west road, toward the mountains, toward whatever came next. The bay mare's hooves pounded a staccato rhythm against the hardpan as they climbed into the foothills. Billy clung to her mane, the ledger's sharp corners digging into his ribs with each stride. Behind them, Rattlesnake Gulch burned, not just the saloon now, but three adjacent buildings caught like kindling in the dry wind. The smoke column twisted into the cobalt sky like a vengeful spirit rising from the wreckage. At the first switchback, the mare faltered. Billy dismounted to find her left foreleg bleeding, a bullet graze he hadn't noticed in the chaos. Her nostrils flared as he examined the wound, blowing hot, anxious breaths against his neck. "Easy, girl," he murmured, tearing a strip from his shirt to bind the injury. The fabric came away black with soot and something darker. His hand shook, not from fear now, but the aftermath of adrenaline leaving his body in waves. The ledger fell open as he worked, its pages fanning in the rising wind. His father's handwriting leapt out at him, neat copperplate annotations beside hand-drawn vein maps. December 3rd, 1863. Secondary shaft shows 18% purity at 200 feet. Tell the boys to follow the blue rock. The words blurred. Billy hadn't realized he was crying until the tears hit the paper, blooming across the ink like tiny explosions. He snapped the book shut just as hoofbeats echoed from the valley below. For riders. Even at this distance, he recognized Lanky Jim's slouched silhouette in the lead. The gang had survived the inferno. The mare sensed his tension, her ears swiveling toward the sound. Billy weighed their options. The main trail to Silver City would be watched, the backcountry routes treacherous without supplies. Then he noticed the rock formation looming above them, two sandstone spires leaning together like old men sharing a secret. His father's voice came to him, clear as if standing beside him. "When you see the twin preachers, head due west. There's a canyon the Apaches used, narrow enough to brush both stirrups, but it'll spit you out behind the judge's courthouse." Billy hadn't thought of that memory in years. Now it unfolded in his mind like one of Pa's survey maps, every contour vivid. He swung onto the mare bareback and urged her upward, leaving the trail behind. The canyon was exactly as remembered, a knife cut through the mountains barely wider than a man's shoulders. The mare balked at entering the gloom, but Billy pressed on, his knees guiding her through the darkness. The air grew damp and cool, smelling of moss and something older, something that had slept in stone since before men dug for metal. Halfway through, the mare's shoe struck something metallic. Billy dismounted to find a rusted cavalry canteen half buried in the gravel. Its stamped markings identified it as 1st New Mexico Volunteers, his father's regiment. The hair on Billy's neck stood erect. He'd never asked how Pa knew this route. A gunshot ricocheted off the canyon wall ahead, sending limestone shards raining down. Lanky Jim's voice echoed mockingly. "Come on out, McCready. Ain't proper to keep a man from his inheritance." Billy's fingers found the Derringer Old Pete had slipped him during their last handshake, a tiny .41 caliber gambler's gun, its pearl handle worn smooth. 2 shots. For men. Then the canyon spoke. A low rumble built beneath their feet, growing until the very walls trembled. Somewhere behind them, the mine timbers, weakened by fire and age, finally surrendered. The sound was like the earth itself coughing up its bones as Rattlesnake Gulch's underground veins collapsed. Lanky Jim's horse screamed as the canyon floor shifted. Billy barely had time to grab the mare's bridle before the world dissolved into dust and thunder. When the shaking stopped, the path ahead stood clear, washed clean by the landslide that had sealed the canyon behind them. Somewhere under tons of rock, Lanky Jim and his gang would never trouble anyone again. The mare exhaled sharply, her sides heaving. Billy stroked her neck, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. Ahead, the canyon's mouth framed a view of Silver City's church spires gleaming in the afternoon sun. And standing in that light, one hand raised to shield her eyes from the dust cloud, was Mary. Mary's calico dress was more smoke than fabric now, its tattered edges fluttering like battle standards as she ran toward Billy. The afternoon sun caught the raw burns crisscrossing her forearms, each blister a testament to her desperate attempts to save the saloon. When she reached him, she didn't embrace him but grabbed the ledger with both hands, her fingers leaving soot prints on the leather. "You're late," she rasped, her voice ruined by smoke. Judge Wilkins convenes court at sundown. Billy swayed on his feet, suddenly aware of every bruise and cut. The bay mare nudged his shoulder, her warm breath stirring his matted hair. Mary's eyes, still startlingly blue against her soot-blackened face, flickered over his injuries. Without a word, she produced a canteen from her skirt pocket. The water tasted of iron and charcoal, but Billy drank greedily until she yanked it away. "Enough. We need you conscious." She turned toward Silver City's courthouse, its whitewashed walls glowing like bleached bones in the sunlight. They're already arguing mineral rights in there. The courthouse steps swarmed with men in broadcloth suits and string ties, railroad agents clutching rolled maps, mining executives mopping sweat from their brows. Through the open doors came the rhythmic thud of a judge's gavel and the nasal drone of legal arguments. Mary shoved through the crowd, her elbow finding ribs with practiced precision. At the threshold, a bailiff barred their way until she brandished the ledger like a preacher holding a Bible. The man's eyes widened at the McCready name stamped in gold leaf on the cover. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and ambition. Judge Wilkins, a cadaverous man with mud chops gone entirely white, presided from a raised dais. Below him, Eli Redfield's lawyer, a dandy in a bottle green waistcoat, was gesturing to a map pinned to the jury box. Clearly demonstrates my client's prior claim. Billy's boots echoed on the hardwood as he strode forward. Every head turned. The lawyer's sentence died mid-syllable when he saw the ledger in Mary's hands. Judge Wilkins adjusted his spectacles. "Young man, this is a court of law, not a livery stable." A titter ran through the spectators. Billy set the ledger on the evidence table with a thump that made the water pitcher tremble. "Your Honor, I believe this belongs in today's proceedings." The next minutes passed in a blur of flipped pages and escalating voices. The judge's clerk nearly dropped his spectacles comparing dates. Railroad men clustered like vultures sensing a dying claim. Through it all, Eli sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, except for his right hand, which tapped that familiar rhythm on his knee, 3 quick, 2 slow. When Judge Wilkins finally cleared his throat, the room fell silent so completely they could hear the courthouse clock's pendulum swinging. The McCready family's 1858 assay records predate Mr. Redfield's purported deed by 6 years. The gavel struck like a gunshot. This court recognizes. Eli moved faster than Billy would have thought possible for a wounded man. His Colt cleared leather as he vaulted the railing, not aiming at Billy, but at Mary. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. The first came from Eli's pistol, shattering the water pitcher. The second came from the courthouse doors, where Sheriff Calloway stood braced against the frame, his revolver smoking. Eli staggered, looking down in disbelief at the red blossom spreading across his green waistcoat. His gold tooth flashed one last time before he collapsed onto the mineral rights map, his blood staining the contested land a darker shade of red. In the stunned silence that followed, Billy became aware of 3 things. Mary had drawn a derringer from her ruined dress. The sheriff's left arm hung useless at his side, fresh blood soaking his bandages. The bay mare was calmly eating the bailiff's hat outside. Judge Wilkins sighed and reached for his gavel. Court adjourned. The setting sun painted Silver City's rooftops gold as Billy stepped onto the courthouse porch. His shadow stretched long across the planks, leaner than it had been 2 days ago, harder at the edges. Behind him, the undertaker's boys carried Eli Redfield's sheet-draped form toward the waiting cart, their boots scuffing up little puffs of dust that hung glowing in the angled light. Mary joined him at the railing, her bandaged hands resting lightly on the wood. The doctor had wrapped her burns in linen strips that smelled of witch hazel, the clean scent cutting through the lingering stench of smoke in their clothes. She didn't speak, just nodded toward the western horizon where Rattlesnake Gulch should have been visible. Instead, a dark smudge marred the skyline, the funeral pyre of the Lone Star Saloon still smoldering 20 miles away. Sheriff Calloway limped up beside them, his arm in a sling made from what looked like a retired gambler's silk cravat. Heard from the stage driver, he sat around the cigar clenched in his teeth. Cookie's alive. Got himself dug in at the Chinese laundry with Gus and old Pete. Billy exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The bay mare, now tethered to the rail with a nosebag of oats, flicked her ears at the sound. Mary reached into her skirt pocket and produced a single object, the saloon's whiskey sign key, blackened but intact. "Found it in the ashes," she said, pressing it into Billy's palm. The metal was still warm. The sheriff blew a smoke ring toward the gathering stars. "Judge says you own near half the territory now, McCready. What do you do with all that copper?" A breeze stirred the cottonwoods along Main Street, carrying the distant clang of the assay office's scales. Billy closed his fingers around the key, feeling its teeth bite into his calluses. Somewhere beneath their feet, veins of or threaded through the rock like destiny itself. "Rebuild," he said at last. "But not just a saloon." His thumb rubbed the soot from the key's bow, revealing engraved letters he'd never noticed before. L.S.&M Company. Turns out Pop partnered with some Sonora miners before the war. That ledger lists 7 played-out shafts perfect for storing whiskey barrels. Mary's laugh was halfway to a cough, but her eyes shone. "Underground whiskey vaults? That's crazy." The sheriff grinned. "Brilliant," Mary corrected. She turned to Billy. When do we start? The bay mare lifted her head, oats forgotten, as if she too awaited orders. Down the street, the assay office's door opened, spilling lamplight onto the boardwalk where three familiar silhouettes stood, Cookie's bulk unmistakable even at this distance, Gus's bowler hat tilted at its usual rakish angle. Old Pete already setting up a chessboard on a barrel. Billy pocketed the key. Now, as they walked toward the waiting figures, the last embers of the Lone Star's funeral pyre winked out behind the mountains. But ahead, in the windows of the assay office, new flames were being lit, lamps kindled for the long night's work of rebuilding. And high above, where the copper veins surfaced in the hills, the first evening primroses opened their yellow petals to the twilight, drinking in the minerals that would make their blooms glow faintly in the dark. Living proof that even the harshest ground could yield something beautiful,